Hi everyone. My name is Michael Hervé. I'm Vice President at CRA. And I have the pleasure to introduce you our next session. So first, let me start with the speakers. So first on my left, Amelia Fletcher is a professor of competition policy at the University of East Anglia, and she was a non-executive director at the CMA for many years. Next, we have Lucia Bonova. She heads the Digital Platforms Unit at the European Commission, responsible for the implementation of the DMA. Axel Desmedt is the president of the Belgian Competition Authority since March this year. Previously, he was the head of the Telecoms and Media Department at the Belgian telecoms regulator. And on my right, first Ariel Ezrachi is a Slaughter and May Professor of Competition Law at Oxford, where he's also the director of the Center for Competition Law and Policy. And Antonio Rangel, he's being Professor of Neuroscience, Behavioral Biology and Economics at Caltech. He notably testified in the US Department of Justice versus Google search case. So we had our first full year of DMA enforcement. And I think for an empirically driven person and from an evaluation of public policy perspective, these are very interesting times. When you think about it, we are facing a large-scale, historical, natural experiment spanning multiple markets. And I think we've discussed that this morning already. What's at stake is huge. Ensuring contestability and fairness, boosting competition, competitiveness, and growth, complementing antitrust and industrial policy. So for sure, the DMA and digital regulation do not lack ambition. Last year, someone on this panel said, well, Europe is probably too big for such an experiment. It should be done on an island. I won't comment on this. However, I think we are past this debate. This is obviously happening. So query is, how does it compare to expectations? And trying to answer this question, we'll explore two broad themes. The first is, what is effective compliance? And how to enforce it. Olivier Gerson just mentioned we have very specific rules within the DMA, yet there is this notion of effectiveness, there is also a question of proportionality, so it looks as if it's not so straightforward, and we've seen the European Commission launching multiple non-compliance investigations. So, and answering this question, we'll also discuss whether behavioral insights can help, which they seem particularly relevant in this context. The second theme we'll look ahead and ask what can be the long-term impact on innovation and growth. And in a sense, the DMA there is a bit of like regulating the past in a way, because it's based on past cases, on markets we understand well, where remedies have failed. That's just how it started. So the two challenges arising from this are, how do you deal with new technologies? And second, how do you deal with Europe's existential threat that has been mentioned this morning of slow productivity? So raises many interesting questions and potentially tensions, which we'll explore with our panelists. Lucia, starting with you, how do first experiences compare to expectations? And in principle, most gatekeepers, or virtually all, should be compliant by now, but you've launched multiple non-compliance investigations, and how do you tell if a firm is effectively compliant?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me. Very happy to be here. So yes, so this whole concept of effective compliance. So I will just start by saying maybe that there isn't a single regulator around the world that would tell you that they are not into an effective compliance, that they do only formalistic compliance. So yes, we do effective compliance, and it actually happens to be also true in our case. So, and as Olivier already hinted, that the DMA was written with, DMA was born from experience and was written really with all these things in mind, and it's clear that there are two things. One is that it's the gatekeepers that need to demonstrate the compliance, so it's really the burden is on them. And the second thing is that compliance must be effective in achieving both the objectives of the regulation, which we know are fairness and contestability, but also the objectives of the individual obligation they are seeking to comply with. So this is quite powerful, and actually the DMA goes even further because, as Olivier just mentioned, it has express anti-circumvention provisions. So it really states plainly that gatekeepers shall not engage in any behavior that undermines this effective compliance. And it goes even farther by saying that this behavior, that it would include behaviors of contractual, commercial and technical nature, but also any other nature, and importantly, use of behavioral techniques or interface designs. And we'll be speaking a lot about behavioral techniques and behavioral economics today, and I think this is very important because it gives us really an explicit and powerful tool to actually enforce the effective compliance in practice. So I think I'm quite proud to say that this has not stayed only on the paper, because as you have just said, we have opened a number of non-compliance cases, and actually there is some which go at the core of this issue. And I would mention the case against Apple, which goes into the really heart of the choice architecture and the choice screen, because there what we can purely observe is that by 7th of March, actually Apple has put up a choice screen. So on the paper, they were compliant because they displayed the choice screen. But based on our understanding and behavioral economics and lots of knowledge which is in the team, we've seen that this choice screen is full of biases. And if we do not address these biases, then essentially this would not be a true choice, and that we are really in the territory where actually the true choice is being subverted by all kinds of design choices of this choice screen. So on this basis, we engage in a regulatory dialogue with Apple, and then soon enough, you will see the results of that. I think that you mentioned the issue of productivity growth challenge. So there clearly, I mean, DMA is not the only tool, and I would say not even the most suitable tool to address the lack of productivity growth challenge. But I will say that it is a piece of legislation which truly unlocks new opportunities. And it unlocks directly opportunities for small companies, for startups, for SMEs, which now post the DMA can do things which just simply were not possible before. And I think this is quite extraordinary, that you would have a regulation which in such a short period of time would bring concrete benefits for these companies to innovate. The companies which before just didn't stand the chance because some other companies were blocking them. So clearly DMA contributes to unlocking of the productivity growth, but it acts as a complement rather than the main trigger. So hopefully we'll see the benefits of that. Finally, on proportionality, so if I understood it well, or actually I'm not sure really I understand it, because I think you mentioned the trade-off between the proportionality and the effectiveness. And for me, proportionality is something which comes into play only when we have an effective solution. Because a solution, however proportionate it may be, if it's not effective, it's not a solution. So it can come into play in situations where you would have two equally effective solutions or two effective solutions. In that situation, yes, there would be the trade-offs, which ones are more or less proportionate. And I will stop there and we will discuss further.
Thank you very much. So, Antonio, you're a bit of a hero to many behavioral economists, having managed to introduce a front and center the importance of behavioral insights in antitrust, and in particular in the DOJ Google case. And as we just discussed, and Lucia agreed with that, that is particularly relevant in the context of the DMA and choice architecture in general. So can you please share a bit of your expertise with us?
Sure. Good morning. I'm a strange animal. I'm a neuroscientist, so thank you for having one of those in the panel. Look, if you're going to do any kind of policy analysis, you're going to need a model of human behavior. And economists have dominated this game. And the basic model in economics is the rational actor model, which assumes that people know their preferences and always make optimal choices based on preferences, information, constraints, prices, etc. An enormous body of scientific evidence and just plain common sense shows that in many consumer decisions that are being discussed here today, this is not the case. This model is not completely valid. And that individuals, consumers, can be put in decision situations that trigger systematic and sizable biases that lead them to make choices that are not what is in their best interest, that maximize their experiential well-being or utility. A canonical example of this, a favorite example of mine, which I think is very striking, is ballots in elections. So if you run an election in many states of the Union, in the United States, you are by law required to randomize the order of the candidates. And the reason that is the case is because whoever gets listed first gets a sizable advantage, other things being equal. Okay? So if your name is Alvarez, hoorah. If your name is Rangel, oof. Okay? And that is just one example of many. I think choice architecture, which is the technical name for the idea that you can change features of the decision situation that have nothing to do with prices, has nothing to do with information, but that have profound effects on consumers' decisions, is another key insight of behavioral economics. And we know quite a bit about how to leverage those knobs in the choice architecture to influence decisions. Defaults, setting defaults is a typical example. Adding a lot of choice friction to preclude you or to make it difficult to change settings that you don't like is another canonical example. Now, tech companies know this. They know this very well, which is why, for example, if you are a user of products of certain American companies, you're constantly nudged with emails and with pop-up menus to do certain things. By the way, the menus, the pop-ups that you get in day one, is not the same as the one that you get in day two, because the other thing that these companies do is they constantly experiment with how to fine-tune minute aspects of this, from changing the brightness to the saliency to the location of the box, that can have enormous effects on choice. Okay? I mean, I cannot tell you. We studied these things in my laboratory. These are very sizable effects. You can switch consumer behavior 30, 40, 50% just by minute changes like that. One final thing I just want to say about this is that one natural question to ask when you realize that there is a systematic body of mechanisms, and by the way, that affect choices, is this different in the tech sector than in the non-tech sector? I mean, after all, we have known for at least 50 years that advertisement and branding matters a lot. So the idea that you can manipulate human behavior has been known for a very long time, including to every Jewish mother in the world. Okay? So what is new about the tech sector? What is special about why behavioral economics is so important for the tech sector? I think it has to do with two things. One is habits. The default assumption in economists, and in my experience in lawyers, is that people sit down, contemplate their choices, however imperfectly, and make deliberative decisions. I'm sorry to tell you, folks, but most of the actions that you take are habitual, are automatic. You are just not thinking. And this is especially pernicious in the tech sector because the development of habits requires, this is from rats to humans, very high frequency, low stakes decision making with immediate feedback. Your phone is a typical device. The internet is a typical device. Any social media platform. These are habit-making machines. If I had to train a rat to get habitized, I would put them on Facebook. Okay? So that's what's special about this. The role of habits, the high frequency in decision making, and then finally the ability of these platforms to constantly run experiments to figure out how to push these mechanisms.
Just a quick follow-up. Now, going back to the DMA, you're the regulator. You have to tell if a remedy design is effective. And I think I've heard, like, what is a true choice, which might be difficult to define. So I suppose my question is, how do you measure effect? So I think we all know by now, hopefully, that defaults matter. The question is, and you hinted on that, is more about the magnitude of effects, and I guess you need a counterfactual. So that these are probably the questions for the regulator to answer. So
yeah, look, I think the body of scientific evidence showing the existence of this effect and the fact that they produce these sizable, robust, constantly replicable effects in the vast majority of users is uncontestable. Now, having said that strong statement, let me make two caveats. One is that I think that there is likely to be non-trivial variation or heterogeneity in these forces across markets, across contexts. And let me give you an example. I mentioned before the ballots, the order of the candidates in the ballots. The impact of the order is quite different in a national high-impact election, like the one we just had in the United States, versus a local election for the school board that nobody cares about. So you need to understand that. And the second thing is that if I were a regulator and I needed, for the purposes of trading off these forces versus others, regulation is a complex issue. You have to balance many, many forces, these Solomonic judgments of how to balance things. And you needed a quantitative measurement of how strong is going to be the impact of this particular policy change, of this proposed change in the interface of the platform you choose. I think there is no substitute for running empirical effects. You need to take this to the data. We know that the effects are going to be there, but whether they're going to be 20% or 65%, we don't know. And the reason is, I think behavioral economics is just not at that stage to be able to make that kind of level of quantitative prediction, but also more importantly, it's because there is substantial variability across markets, across platforms. So for example, I mentioned before habits. I think that habits are critical in the choices of many of these products, and different markets have different history of usage and penetration of these products, which means that the same intervention, depending on the depth and spread of the habits in the population, are going to have very different effects. All of these things need to be tested. By the way, I'm almost done with this, the tech companies know this. They know this very well, which is why they try to hire my students non-stop to try to run these types of studies. And this is why many tech companies have built behavioral teams. And if I may, this is my contribution to the panel, I hope. If I may say something as a taxpayer, I urge the regulators to consider building their own behavioral teams. Otherwise, you're fighting a battle, disarm. And certainly, at the very least, get the data of all of these experiments to know what they know. But I think there is no substitute for running these behavioral things. And maybe just to say why, it's very important to know why people are doing what they're doing, not just the outcome. So let me give you an example. Europe decided a few years ago to change what happens when I enter a website. Okay, and now in the United States, every time I enter a website, every few weeks, I need to have to make some choices. Now, is that thing effective or not? Well, one thing you can ask is how often do people click or opt into privacy or not? I would like to know, as a behavioral economist, how are people making that choice? Are they reading those options? Do they understand the options? How long are they taking? Are they being habitized or not? There is no substitute for collecting data on that type that requires a behavioral team.
So I feel I need to let Lucia respond briefly to this recommendation. And because, I mean, the CMA, we know there is a team that has been set up, behavioral economist team. What is the status at the European Commission?
Yes, no, thank you. And I think this is super important. And as I already said, this clearly informed one of our first intervention cases, which goes to the heart of it, because DMA clearly anticipates this the existence of behavioral biases, as Antonio just eloquently explained. There is a whole science behind it, and this is super important, in particular in obligations which benefit directly the users. And of course, as Antonio already hinted, gatekeepers can be tempted to seek to subvert the choice by all kinds of behavioral designs. And clearly, when we are dealing with the choice screens, we've seen, the power of the first place, let's say, bias, the friction in making the choice, the right degree of information you provide to the user when making the choice, and how actually all these elements influence the choice making. And there is studies which are run by the companies themselves, as Antonio explained, potentially by his students or ex-students, and we have access to this information. I mean, for me, the biggest, let's say, danger to the success of DMA in this area is, as also Antonio already mentioned, is a little bit the habit or the status quo bias. And I like making a small natural experiment in a room, and I will try in this room because it's an extremely sophisticated audience. So I assume that there is roughly half of the room which has an iPhone, and the other half has some version of Android. So let's see how many people of those who, before the DMA, were using on iOS Safari, and those who on Android were using Chrome actually changed their browser post-DMA when they were presented with the choice screen. So let's see what happens. Raise the hands, those who changed. Don't be shy. Tell us DMA works. Well, and so you see, this is a very sophisticated audience, but it actually shows that we do have biases or habits which actually we are not willing to change. So I think that this goes really at the heart of the DMA, and I will make a little pitch. So, the success of DMA lies in two things. One is obviously in the business users taking up the opportunities, but the other one is also in end users, so all of us to actually changing our own habits. Now to the question as to how or what is our capacity to deal with this. So we do have actually behavioral economists in our team, which is extremely useful, and I'm extremely grateful we have someone like that. We hope we'll be able to kind of scale up the team. We are still kind of a little startup, so I may say that at this stage it's still okay to have just a couple of these people. We do actually get access to the A/B testings and various testings that the companies which we regulate do themselves, so that is of course very informative. And we are also collecting lots of data on the choice screens and on the defaults to understand the user behavior, so that ex post we can potentially adjust certain design choices, because of course now we are working on the basis of the science and the predictions, but then the real life will show. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ariel, what's your take on the role of behavioral insights in digital regulation?
Yeah, thank you. I'll follow up on the idea of sophisticated audience. And I think many of us have this sense of autonomy and a sense that despite whatever we hear here, we're able to overcome these biases. It's something that you find again and again. And the reality is that most of us, when we are online, we walk down a path that was designed for us. And with our sense of autonomy, we reach exactly the destination that someone on the other side, combination of psychologists and engineers, decided for us. And because of that, when you look at the Digital Services Act, dark patterns are prohibited. When you look at the DMA, so there is an effort to address these distortions. And the idea is that whereas in general, when we look at consumers, we try to identify vulnerable consumers, the reality is that despite there being some heterogeneous effects between various groups, we are all affected one way or another. And just to share, we recently completed an empirical experiment in Oxford where we established a website, we sold financial products, and it's a bait and switch. At the end of the experiment, we serviced the participants with dark patterns. And the aim was to see whether education, financial position, provide you with some sort of a buffer, help you in any way. The answer is not really, okay? So that is one insight. The second insight, which is quite interesting, in our experiment, at the end, those that were led through a dark pattern to accept our offer, they reached a payment webpage where they had to insert their credit card details. We had a chat yesterday on the ethics of that, but all of it was approved, and of course people were briefed afterwards. But the point is that then you see that the effect of dark patterns is dissolving after a few seconds. So if you need to introduce more friction because you require the user to insert credit card details, you're already losing. And that highlights the power of the platforms. That highlights the power of the ecosystems. If you are part of your habit, just surfing, and all I need is to create some friction to stop you from getting somewhere or to facilitate your approach to another service, it is much easier if I'm the powerful incumbent. And that brings me to my last comment, and this is the amplifying effect of ecosystem. Dark patterns are extremely effective. But when you combine that with the reality of ecosystems that already have your user data, you probably have an account. They have a God's view over all your actions. They have data that includes data about the market, data about your preference. They can perfect the cues to really impact on you. They affect the demand for products through friction or any other patterns. They also affect the supply of products through other elements. When you take all of that into account, you realize that the distorting zone that is created by dark patterns is even greater than the one that you would see when all you do is look at our behavior separated, independent of the context in which we are served with those dark patterns. And that's certainly something that I hope the DMA and the DSA can help us tackle. Thank you.
Thank you. Amelia, do you have further thoughts? I mean, I know that the UK regime, the DMCC, is more flexible. So in a way, effects can play an even bigger role there. So what are your thoughts?
And thanks, and I'm very happy to be at this great conference. I would just say for those people in the audience who think they're sophisticated enough to overcome their own cognitive biases, there is a cognitive bias that I don't think has been mentioned so far, which is called overconfidence bias. In general, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I fully agree that real human behaviour should lie at the heart of understanding competition in markets. And I think we do now have a huge amount of evidence, as Antonio has described, on the prevalence and power of cognitive biases. I do, however, also agree with Antonio's caveats that this behaviour can vary across contexts, individuals, countries, and even over time. This, though, raises, I think, a really interesting question. We often, in competition policy and regulation, don't have perfect information. And therefore, we have to make some prior assumptions. And so the interesting question I want to raise for this audience is, does that mean that we should, as our prior assumption, be assuming that consumers are rational actors, homo economicus, as it were, unless we have firm evidence to the contrary? Or and this, as you can tell from the way I'm going, is what I think, is should we assume that our base assumption, our base prior, actually be that cognitive biases are likely to exist, at least amongst consumers, unless we have a very good reason to think otherwise, and also that firms are likely to be aware of those cognitive biases and likely to react to them. I think if we take that really seriously and we change our prior, that could have some very serious implications for competition policy generally. I've done some thinking through what those might be, but I think others are also thinking through what the implications might be. In terms of digital regulation, I think what it means, and Julia's already referred to this really, is it means we need to focus not just on what choices are being provided to consumers under regulation, but also how those choices are being offered. And as Julia already noted, I actually think the DMA is pretty sophisticated on this, and in particular I would call out Article 13.6, which is the anti-circumvention measure, which prohibits circumvention of DMA rules by offering choices to the end user in a non-neutral manner via the design of a user interface. And without referring to any specific non-compliance investigations, although in fact Julia did, I'm very much hoping that the EU is going to take that provision seriously when enforcing the DMA, and I'm reassured by her comments. In the meantime, as you say, the UK DMCC Act is actually an act that has quite a lot in it, but I'm talking about the digital markets regulation bit of it, has a more flexible framework than the DMA. The CMA, as you mentioned, also has long had a behavioural economics team. Actually, the OFT, which is its predecessor, prior to 2013, also had a behavioural economics team, and it has a long history of considering the implication of behavioural economics for competition in markets, and in particular the role of choice architecture. For example, in past CMA market studies, the CMA has focused on the way in which consumers are steered towards options that might involve giving away excessive personal data, slightly goes to Antonio's question about cookie pop-ups, and also the way in which frictions have been used to prevent consumers from directly downloading apps on their phone. So I would expect, although I am not the CM anymore and therefore absolutely can't talk for them, not that I ever did, but I would fully expect the UK to be placing choice architecture firmly within their digital regulation.
Thank you. So we've been focusing on end users in this discussion, and I think like when you're looking at a big debate, we know that business users play a very important role as well. And in particular, many national competition authorities are helping with that. Axel, what do you think national competition agencies can do to help in the DMA to achieve this effective compliance phase?
Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me at the conference. And indeed, the role of national competition authorities is still very important. One of them is, when you refer to the business communities, to explain the DMA and to take advocacy initiatives, such as we've done recently, organizing, for example, a conference together with ACM around the functioning of the DMA, especially for the business community, the SMEs, etc., that do not have the staff simply to understand and read all of this. And so this is, I think, a very important role to go to your local community and to make sure that they know that this is now applicable and that they can actually use it. So that's number one. Two, and this is something that I've raised since the very beginning, that the DMA started to be drafted together with DG Connect and DG Comp. There is a very important local connection to the DMA. While we are talking on the end of the big tech, of course, about global players that need to be tackled at European level, At the level of the complaints, we're talking very often about local players who are much more in contact with their local authorities rather than the European Commission. So we have an important role as national authorities to collect those complaints and to be able to investigate ourselves also together in conjunction with joint investigative teams with the Commission like we have. We have, for example, we have sent staff to the European Commission to have a joint team on that. But I think it's very important that local or national competition authorities are very much involved in explaining and collecting those complaints to reduce the thresholds towards the authority that is ultimately responsible to investigate and sanction, which is the European Commission. So that's 2. 3, let's not forget that this is not only about big tech. This is not only about global players, but also about national players, national platforms. And of course, they're not gatekeepers, but the principles of the DMA are very relevant also for national players. And sometimes we see behaviors that are being tackled under the DMA, but which have been inspired or where obligations have been inspired by competition rules that still apply, complementary to the DMA, and that can be applicable to national platforms also. And there we see at the national level also a very important role in terms of inspiring national authorities for the DMA in the direction of national competition authorities. 4, I think it's important also to think that national competition authorities may have a bigger role on controlling the fairness issue, because we've talked about 2 things in the DMA, contestability and fairness. And contestability is about being able to take a role on the market, but fairness is about something slightly different. It's about having a fair contract with a big player. And there I think the role of national competition authorities is key, because we will be confronted with small companies having a contract with a huge player, and where their negotiating power will be very limited to none, and where it's important for a national competition authority to give priority to this fairness objective. So this is, I think, a last role. And the very last point that I want to make in light of what has been said on behavioral economics, I think national competition authorities also have to raise the question about governance and thinking how they are organized, because we're talking about things that may go beyond competition law only when we talk about dark patterns, etc. So we have to think also about whether the mandate that we currently have under competition rules only, whether that is sufficient to tackle the kind of issues that we've just heard about in a very interesting way by my predecessing speakers.
Very good, thank you. And staying with you, given your expertise in telecom regulation, what do you see, what are the points of convergence and divergence between the DMA and telecom regulation?
Yes, well, I think when I look at the telecom regulation, that DMA is a kind of telecom regulations on steroids. So clearly all the lessons have been learned from the telecoms regulation, where we had some open ends. So there are a lot of similarities, of course, but there are key differences. And it's on steroids. Why? Because some things are simply evacuated, like discussions about market definition. It's out. We have core platform services. It's very clear what they are, and they are predefined. We used to have discussions about market definition with, is self-supply in, is there the chain substitution, all those kind of discussion, is a cable included into the market together with copper, and etc. I mean, those kind of discussions are out. So that's the first point of efficiency. Second, we used to have discussions on dominance, because the telecoms regulation is about S&P players that are regulated. Here, no, the core platform services are defined, and also the gatekeepers are being defined. So that issue is also out. We used also to have discussions about the remedies. Even though they were listed in the telecom package, you still had to choose and justify why you choose those remedies and justify them towards the type of problem you had on the market. All of that is also out, because now the obligations are set in a regulation which is directly applicable. So I think really the DMA is, in terms of regulatory architecture, is really a fantastic tool compared to what we used to have in telecoms. Also, allocation of the burden of proof, the anti-circumvention clause that was mentioned earlier, all of that we did not have in the telecoms regulation. Still, there are very strong parallels, the three-prong test, so market definition, SMP, and remedies. In the DMA, you also have core platform services, gatekeeper, and then the obligation. The second point of convergence between both is that both are coming initially from competition law. So in telecoms also, before having the telecoms package, there were a lot of competition cases. And that has led to what we know as the telecom package and the remedies we have and SMP, etc. But there is a key difference. In the telecoms market, we were talking about monopolies that needed to be liberalized. So we were trying to get from a state-owned or state-organized economy to a liberalized market. That's totally different now, because the idea with telecoms was we liberalize and then we gradually go towards competition law and we remove ex-ante regulation. This is still now the theory or the philosophy of telecoms regulation. With the DMA, it's totally different. We start from companies, like was said this morning, who have organically grown towards a position where they have huge market shares, up to 90 or 95% market share. So this is a market-generated dominant position, which is totally different. And we are not moving towards competition law. No, we are moving towards ex-ante regulation. So we're going in kind of reverse directions. The other point is that, and that's also certainly something for the better, is that the DMA is being managed mainly at EU level, and in light of what is said in the Draghi report and the need to have for example, European telecoms market, the DMA clearly starts from the fact that, this is managed at the European level and it's the European Commission who has to take the lead on this. Maybe a word of, let's say, where it is maybe less less good than the telecoms regulation. It's that the remedies, which used to be the remedies in telecoms, are now obligations, which are in the regulation. And it may be more difficult to remove some of the obligations that may be not necessary anymore or that are not being used. Typically in telecoms, we had remedies that in the end were not used. And they were removed pretty easily by national competition, by national regulatory authorities. Here you need to change the regulation, even though there are some means to do this. I think it is less flexible than what you had in telecoms.
Thank you. I'd like to explore this idea of removing remedies, because I think it's a very interesting question. If you think about the DMA, there is the idea that you must see effects, because if there is no effects, it means there is no effective compliance, or that the rule itself is not effective, so was not needed in the first place, and then maybe would need to be removed. And also, building on what we heard this morning from Teresa Rivera, that we need to be focused. That was one of the key points she made, which in a way makes sense. We sort of, with everything we have to deal with, if you want to be focused, maybe you don't want to spend a lot of time trying to design a remedy that actually no one cares about. And that is a bit the worry, I think, with some of the rules with the DMA, when we don't see business users coming in, it's where are they? I mean, it's meant to be a huge opportunity for innovation and growth, and if they are not knocking at the door, what's going on? So, just Lucia, what are your views? What is the conclusion to draw if remedies are not used in the context of the DMA?
Look at this economist. We just started and he already wants to remove obligations. Okay. No, so I mean, clearly looking at the legislative history of DMA, so DMA was based on certain predictions about the effects of certain obligations, which themselves were based on a certain experience, which was actually quite developed over the years. And I think it's fair to say that now we are, our expectation is that these are the right obligations to tackle this these conducts, because these are the known conducts which we are going to tackle. But it's fair to say that if our predictions do not materialize, indeed the question should be asked. Now, I will also say that now you're trying to say that if it's not working, it must mean two things. Either the company is not compliant or that we don't need that obligation at all. So on the first, let's say, premise, I will just demystify it. I don't think that, let's say, compliance equals effectiveness. Or lack of effectiveness means non-compliance per se. So, I mean, obviously, it goes at the heart of it. I said that it may be that our predictions were wrong, that the company is actually compliant, both with the letter and the spirit, and it is not bringing the benefits which we hoped for various reasons, biases, etc. So it may be the legislator didn't get it right. I mean, we haven't seen that so far. I think we are more in a territory where we see non-compliance, and so we haven't tested that in practice. Now, how to tackle a situation where over time it would show indeed that some obligations are not needed, for instance. So, I mean, I think Olivier said this morning, earlier this morning, that obviously we can actually adjust the DMA. So DMA is what it is, nothing less and nothing more. It's in its current state, but it is evaluated every 2 years. And I think it should be evaluated because we should, as a good regulator, we should be looking at whether our intervention worked and whether actually the regulation itself delivered on its objectives. So we will definitely look into these questions. Then we can adjust, and I think it's fair to adjust a new regulation over time. So we can add obligation, new CPSs as needed. And now maybe the last thought I will put out is that whether we need to remove an obligation, as Axel said. So, I mean, the question is that, I mean, arguably, if the obligation is not needed, so no one will be complying with it, and I think it goes also to what the EVP Rivera said, is that we need to focus. So I just do not see us as a good regulator, which would pick as a priority an enforcement action against the implementation of an obligation which is not needed. So I think there are various ways of dealing with this issue short of removing the obligation, because there may be situations where actually that obligation makes sense, and other situations where it doesn't make sense.
Thank you. So, conscious of time, I think I'll move on to the second theme of this panel, and might come back. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but let's see if we have time for this. So, just to set the scene, it was discussed at length this morning in very interesting panels. So there is this growing idea that competition can be and perhaps should be balanced with other policy objectives, such as growth and investment. And the UK CMA in particular seems to be of this view. And this can be confusing to some because when you think about it, competition is about maximizing output. It was mentioned by Olivier Garçon as well this morning. And just to give an example, we don't care about high prices themselves. We care about high prices because they reduce output. It's not just a transfer between consumers and firms. It's worse than that. So from that perspective, the two objectives should be aligned. It doesn't mean that you can't have other interests, but from a competition perspective, it's difficult to reconcile these ideas. So that will be the question that will be debated. Second, there is a bit of a change of attitude towards bigness. Initially, you had many times big is not bad. Then it evolved into big is potentially bad, and we need to forget about abuse, and we have the DMA in a way. And we have yet a new idea that there is a trade-off between ability to scale and competition. So on regulation specifically, is the goal just to regulate a monopoly, or is it to prevent the emergence of a monopoly in the first place? And if we have efficient regulation in place to deal with market power, does it mean that we can be more comfortable letting a firm grow and get the benefits of efficiencies and scale without the risk associated with market power that can come with size? And this question seems particularly relevant when it comes to regulating new technologies. So Amelia, with this setup, good luck. How can we reconcile these tensions?
Okay. Thank you. It's an essay question. First, let me cover the link between competition and growth, and I will hurry over this because actually we discussed a lot of this in the first panel, I think. I mean, there are clearly concerns about growth in the UK, the EU, and actually across a lot of the world, and an increasing push for more active industrial policy. I want to make 3 points about the relationship between industrial policy and competition policy. The first is the very obvious one, that actually a lot of the concerns about growth aren't actually about concerns related to competition being bad for growth, but actually about concerns about there not being enough competition, and that actually being a thing that is stopping growth occurring. And I think that concern is actually a lot of what underpins the development of digital regulation in the UK and in the EU, and actually a lot of other interventions. So, for example, you will be aware that the CMA has a market investigation regime under which it can impose requirements to address identified competition concerns. We heard earlier that I think it's Italy now has that as well. The CMA has used these powers in the past to impose substantial market transformation initiatives. An example was the imposition of open banking, which was an intervention which the banks would never have introduced themselves, which the CMA was focused on as a competition-enhancing intervention, but actually which has facilitated a host of new innovations and hopefully will be important in driving growth in the UK. So I think that link between competition and growth is still very much there, and a really good reason for doing competition policy. I also, however, note that certainly in the UK, in the Blair and Brown era, I remember them having a mantra that our industrial policy is competition policy, as though that was the only thing that you needed. And I think that was also misguided. We know there's all sorts of market failures that can limit investment in competitive markets and otherwise, especially relating to coordination, hold-up, etc. By providing a clear vision of what it wants to achieve in the future, combined with targeted industrial support, government industrial policy can clearly be very effective in overcoming these market failures. But, and I think this did come out earlier, when designing that industrial policy, it's really important still to work with the vein of competition rather than against it. And we heard that it's also true in the EU that there is this collegiality between DG competition and other parts of the Commission. In the UK, the CMA has a formal role to advise government on the competition implications of government policy. And I would hope and expect the CMA to be very heavily involved in the UK in helping the government fine-tune its industrial policy to really help it harness innovation and not harm it. Third, in response more directly to your question, I think there can sometimes be a tension between competition and investment. Most commonly when there's really quite a lot of competition, which tends to not be the arenas within which competition policy gets itself involved. But yeah, there can be situations where even with less competition, there can be a conflict. So, obvious example, two firms might each have part of a jigsaw in relation to a difficult R&D puzzle. If you allow those firms to coordinate or even merge rather than competing, you may get the innovation and you may not otherwise. That's why we have sympathetic competition law treatment of R&D joint ventures. Moreover, there, I think in the UK and EU have been numerous mergers that have been cleared over the years on the basis that the competition concerns arising from the merger were relatively small compared to the much bigger long-run potential benefits for innovation. So I don't think there's that much that's new in terms of this identifying this tension, except that I think that competition authorities haven't necessarily always done well enough in explaining how they were well aware of this tension and really making some very sensible policy balances. Obviously, they need to keep thinking about whether they're making the balances right, think about this innovation, defence, etc. But my hunch is actually the changes, if any, will be marginal because they're largely doing the right thing. Lastly, let me get to the bigness point. I think there's actually two possible bigness issues. The first is just this idea that companies can have too much political power, and this actually creates problems for all sorts of areas of policy, not just competition policy. I would just like to say, having been involved in the development of the DMCC and to some extent also the DMA, I don't think that bigness was actually the issue that anyone was really focused on. I think it was just good old market power. But the second bigness issue, and I just thought about this earlier listening to Jan de Locke, and he can tell me in a minute that I'm mad, but he highlighted how the combination of globalization and technical change have led to some very concentrated markets globally. And it's happened for kind of good economic endogenous growth reasons, but that actually now it risks, and in some cases has led to reduced business dynamism, with smaller firms, more disruptive entrants really unable to get into those markets. And that's going to be really bad for the longer term. So this is a different, I think, bigness issue. And I think it does raise some really interesting new policy issues in that it might justify actively pro-competitive interventions that go beyond simply preventing anti-competitive conduct. And I think you can also see the DMA and DMCC in that environment as really trying to proactively open up markets, even requiring some things where there wasn't necessarily any anti-competitive behaviour that they're trying to address. And specifically in the UK, the DMCC enables the CMA to take what are called pro-competitive interventions. Question is, do we need more of this in more industries where there's been global concentration? In the UK, this is again something we can do with market investigations. Does that concern help motivate the need for an EU new competition tool?
Thank you very much. I think on the example you gave on innovation, I mean, if it unlocks innovation, as I think Olivier Gasson hinted on that, it would be pro-competitive. So even there, it's not so easy, I think, to see the direct tension. It would just be pro-competitive, and then it would be similar to what we were doing. But Ariel, what are your views on these questions, and in particular, friction between the UK competition DMCC and the new attitude towards bigness, and how do we retain intellectual integrity?
Thank you. So I'm less optimistic. I think in theory, it's a no-brainer. Everything is aligned. You can tell a story that works extremely well. The practicality, and I'm speaking here about the UK, I think is much more challenging, maybe because it's a smaller economy, maybe because it's post-Brexit, maybe because of several other things. But you have two paths that you can choose to take when you try to achieve growth. You can take the path that we are advocating here, and I think it will be hard to find someone here that doesn't agree, the path of the DMA, DMCC, competition enforcement, the path that the CMA is planning on trying to champion. But you can also take the political quick path, the shortcut, where what you try to do is to get some money invested in your economy. And you do that by standing alongside the CEOs of big tech companies, telling them that you want them to invest. And the optics from the UK at the moment should at least make you feel slightly uncomfortable, because it is not clear exactly whether the path that we're advocating here is going to be the path that is going to dominate, or whether it will be the other path that is a path that is more opportunistic. It's more short-term. It might generate much more growth in the short term, and that might be very necessary. There might be a very good reason for that. But long-term, it actually enhances the problems that we are discussing. And the reality is that then, when you think about competition enforcement, when you think about the DMCC, they are not enforced in a vacuum. They are enforced within this economic context, within this political context. And certainly, if you think about conduct requirement or pro-competitive agenda, it could, I fear, it could be influenced if the economic reality will dictate just greater support to direct investment. Now, in terms of the intellectual integrity, so on one hand, and Sarah Cadell referred to this balancing exercise, and I believe that what she referred to is an external balancing, and that's just the reality. The reality is that if you're told that your market is in such state that you need now to take some measures to bring in investments, then so be it. What I hope is that we will not see internal balancing. What I hope is that we'll not see attempts to make competition somehow serve the agenda. And I refer, for example, to the proposition in the context of telecom that was, how about you widen your market definition? Many of you are familiar with, which would completely lead us to an analysis that is very distant from competition analysis just to achieve a certain goal. So the hope is that we can, even if reality dictates that the government needs to take certain actions, we can still retain the integrity of the competition analysis.
Thank you very much. Lucia, briefly, it was mentioned before that we talked about the market investigations tool, and the Draghi report mentions the new competition tool, which would be the equivalent at the EU level. Is it something that you're considering as well in the context of digital regulation, or is it off the table?
Yeah, so maybe again a little bit of a history. So actually before the DMA was born, we were contemplating an NCT. It's a little bit like, you know, you are hoping for a girl and then you get a boy, but then boom, you have to do with it anyway. So we have now, and the boys are great. I have 2 of those, so I can say that. So now we have the DMA, and I think that is important in digital markets. I mean, of course, the Draghi report is about all markets and digital markets, but I think in digital markets, we have DMA. We have actually quite a strong antitrust practice. So I think before you start thinking of a 3rd child, you should really try to identify the delta. What is it I'm not covering with the DMA, with the antitrust? And then maybe at some point we will reach a conclusion that it's needed. But I think at this stage we should try to see the benefits of on DMA as a tool to tackle certain issues in digital markets, and then also of the concurrent application of the DMA and antitrust before actually jumping on any new tools. I mean, I'm speaking in my own capacity, obviously.
Thank you. So Axel, I think a new competition tool or market investigations power are, I mean, I saw it by many national competition authorities, and I think one thing we've heard many times, and one point everyone agreed upon this morning is the problem of fragmentation. So that is a big issue. Of course, if it's at the EU level, there is no problem there for the internal market. If it's at a national level, that's a different story. So what's your take on this?
Yes, thanks for the question. So there is indeed a real big difference between a new competition tool at European level and the discussion that took place around that. And Lucia is very right to remember where it comes from and at what moment that was discussed. It was at the moment where DMA did not exist yet, and where indeed you were still looking at what we would do. So it was not really like a general new competition tool like is now mentioned in the Draghi report. So that is really in terms of the context. But indeed, at national level, several member states have this tool that exists. So it really depends on your national legislation. And some national competition authorities are requesting this addition to their toolkit when they do not have that. We have in Belgium we do not have that, to be clear, or only through provisional measures. But first, given that we have been growing the last 2 years very recently with new resources, we want to make use first and foremost of the sector inquiry tool. So I think that's already a very powerful tool that you can use to analyze the market and make recommendations. So that's really a key priority that we will be developing in the coming months or years. And but indeed, in terms of the national competition tool as it is being used by other authorities, I hear they appreciate that tool very much, and I'm certainly not excluding that it's something that we would be also favoring having. But 2 words of caution. First, you talked about fragmentation, and everybody has read the Draghi report, where there's one key point coming out of the report. It's single market. Much more than competition issues or problems. It's single market. So what we have to avoid, of course, is through through the new competition tool to have again fragmentation as a result of national usage of those national competition tools. So that's one word of caution that I would like to raise with regards to the usage of that tool. Second, and that's maybe more from a Belgian perspective, as a competition authority, you're an administrative authority, of course, so to impose general measures is also legally and constitutionally sensitive, so you have to be careful on how you craft or how you deal with that. Maybe that's different in other member states, but clearly we would have to be very centered around individual measures and remedies that are imposed and not general measures, because we are not politically responsible towards Parliament. So that's a second caution.
Thank you very much. So we've been talking about growth as if it was just a matter of quantity, but there is obviously a question of quality. And this morning it was discussed a couple of times, the trajectory of innovation. So Ariel, you've been discussing this point in several books. So what is your view on the trajectory of innovation, and should the DMA try and influence that?
Yes, thank you. So I think the DMA can be a game changer. It certainly has the potential to be. And what I'm concerned about most are 2 qualitative dimensions of innovation that I think are specifically significant to our common welfare. And these are elements that we discussed in Big Tech Barons and Innovation, Maurice and I. And the first one is the heterogeneity of innovation, whether what we are going to see is more sustaining innovation or disrupting innovation. It is often the case that when you look at the larger ecosystems, they are presented as coral reefs because, of course, they attract a lot of applications, they attract a lot of business and a lot of innovation, and that is welcome. It is extremely beneficial for us as a society. But what you also see is that when you have disruption, where you have disruptors that try to enter those markets, they are met with quite significant pushbacks. And that stems from the fact that ecosystems, or the companies that control the main platforms and the main ecosystems, they control quite a lot of the parameters of competition and quite a lot of the gates. So we already mentioned the control over demand, the control over supply in the sense of interoperability or just sheer access to the market. But they also control indirectly whatever is happening outside the market. So your ability, if you're a disruptor that is unlikely to gain access into the market, your ability to gain capital, to raise capital, is fairly limited. And because of that, what we have seen in the past years is that the dominant value chain become more and more dominant. So if you have a platform and it has a certain value chain, anyone that is trying to disrupt that value chain will find it very hard to reach the market. And in that respect, what it led to is limited commercialization of disruption, limited capital investment in disruptors. And I think here the DMA can help. Even if the DMA is not exactly set to achieve this qualitative dimension, it will because of the nature of the provisions. Then there is another qualitative dimension, which is the value of innovation. Generally speaking, when you think about it from an economic perspective, innovation is positive. We assume that innovation is the creation of a new process, new product, something that is positive. This is how we think of it in competition. This is how we think of it in terms of competition agencies, international organizations. And the reason for that is that our base assumption is that innovation reacts to demand. When we demand something, companies appreciate that, they therefore invest money, they innovate, and we benefit. But the reality is much more complex. In many ways, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And the reason being that there is a link between power and the toxicity of innovation. The more powerful you are as a company, the more you can ignore the desires of your customers and develop innovation that is actually promoting other agendas or your own profitability. And it's most obvious if you think, for instance, about attention markets, multi-sided attention markets. So we are the users, we are the customers in a sense, but the drivers, the money, they come from those who either wish to target us with ads or manipulate us or target us in other ways. And it's all about retention. And what you have then is a certain anomaly. You have a market, you have an innovation engine that it is all about creating and developing innovations that in essence harm us as individuals. And here, this is where it's really important for us to just appreciate this qualitative side of innovation. I don't think anyone here thinks that we as a society should celebrate the fact that if your kid, if your son or daughter are playing on a computer, then there is now innovation that can determine their mental state based on the way they type on the keyboard. Or if they're using VR headset, the movement of their eyes is now being factored in to know how to service them or how to manipulate them. Or more generally, that algorithms are developed in order to identify weakness point, regardless of the impact on your mental state, just to lead you to a certain outcome or to take certain actions. If you look, and we have, at the type of patents that are being registered, at the investment that we see all around in that specific sector, you would find it hard. It's more about the implementation rather than the technology, because technology can be used in various ways, but it's hard to justify the implementation. So certainly there is an element here of toxicity which we shouldn't celebrate, and that is because it affects not only the mental health, not only the autonomy of individuals, but if you think about our social cohesion and if you think about our democracy, I think it's quite easy to make the link between these innovations, the need to create retention, the need to generate income, and the impact we see when it comes to our society. So contestability can help shift, not because we're trying to make a value judgment on the quality of innovation, but if we enable more disruption, then there will be more capital that will go into alternative value chains, and all of us as a society would benefit. One last comment. We speak a lot about markets as the solution, or even now I presented it as just let the market, run its magic. I think it's really important to stress, and it was mentioned earlier as well, the need for support policies. The reason Europe is not doing that well is not because of only some markets being imperfect. It's also because of access to capital, or lack of it. It is also because difficulties in commercialization. It is because of the university sector not receiving enough funds. So the government has a role to play. It is sometimes quite easy for governments to outsource the problem to the market, because you can then just sit and witness the market and then blame the market for its imperfections. If you look around the world, government that succeeded, when markets succeeded, did so because they didn't choose winners, they didn't pick up the winners, but they created the conditions for those winners to emerge. And I think here we're certainly lagging behind.
Thank you. So, Antonio, I think there is an interesting question then, which is, who should decide what is good or bad? Is it for the regulator, or is the problem more that users don't understand sufficiently well? So essentially, if you want to influence choice of users, which is at the core of the DMA, having in mind that you want to influence the trajectory of innovation, that's, I mean, a lot of responsibility on regulators, but how do you do this by maybe more educating users? Is there a way of doing that?
Look, I think that one of the things that the universe teaches scientists and entrepreneurs is epistemological humility. The idea that you don't really know what's going to work and what's not going to work in advance. So innovation, in my view, and I'm talking as a scientist and as an entrepreneur, requires trial and error, a lot of trial and error, and then letting nature and consumers tell you what they like and what they don't. That has to be there. The problem, of course, is you want signals from the market that are really good signals about what is truly serving consumers. And if you are in markets in which, for the number of reasons that have been repeatedly discussed, the consumers are making mistakes or are being manipulated, when these innovations are being tried out, you don't get feedback on what innovation is valuable from welfare point of view or not. So I for sure hope that regulators don't get into the business of telling us what technology to develop. It would offend me deeply. But I do hope that regulators keep their eye on the ball and know when markets are being manipulated or not, put their finger there to make sure that we're getting good consumer choice that really provides the feedback to the innovation ecosystem to drive innovation in the right directions. That's the way I think about it.
Very good. Conscious we're a bit over time, so just last comment, Amelia and Lucia, on these. I mean, 1 minute if you manage.
On what point?
I think on this point on whether to influence and to push one. For example, if there is a trade-off between contestability and consumer welfare, whether you want to, as a regulator, you want to push for one option because you think that in the long run there is something more than that, even though consumers might say that they prefer this option, they don't see the long-term benefits, this kind of trade-off.
So in very brief terms, I think that the contestability should be given weight over short-term consumer welfare, because in the end I think the contestability will deliver long-term consumer welfare. And there have already been lots of shouts about kind of consumer harm resulting from the fact that now you have to go onto a separate tab to look at Google Maps or to look at Google Travel or whatever. Sorry, I shouldn't have picked any particular example. But yes, maybe that is a short-term consumer harm. I'm not going to say whether it is or it isn't. But it's designed to improve contestability, and hopefully over the longer term that will generate consumer benefits, and I think that's the prize here.
Thank you. Lucia, do you have any last comment?
I agree with Amelia.
Okay, very good. That makes it easier, and well, please join me in thanking the panel and